Sometimes the universe doesn't bring someone back into your life directly. Sometimes it lets their name appear in a conversation you were never supposed to hear. And that may be exactly what happened to your soulmate. They were somewhere completely ordinary, focused on their own life, when your name suddenly entered the room. At first, they tried to ignore it. They told themselves it was nothing. But then they heard the way someone was talking about you, and something inside them immediately became still. Because the person they were describing didn't sound like the version of you they remembered. They were talking about what you're doing now, how you've changed, what you've been building, and the life you've created while they were no longer close enough to see it. Your soulmate wasn't prepared for that. They had created their own picture of your life after the connection ended. Maybe they imagined you were still thinking about the past. Maybe they assumed you were waiting for something to change. Maybe they believed that without them, certain parts of your life would remain exactly where they left them. But one conversation began destroying that picture. Imagine walking past a window and accidentally seeing a place you once called home, only to discover that everything inside has been transformed. The walls are familiar, but the atmosphere is different. The person living there is different. That is what hearing your name may have felt like for them. Suddenly, they were listening carefully without wanting anyone to notice. Every new detail made them more curious. Every sentence seemed to reveal another piece of a life they no longer had access to. And then they heard something that made their hearts sink, not because something terrible had happened to you, but because you were doing far better than they ever expected. You had changed quietly, without announcing it, without asking them to notice, and without needing them to return. For the first time, they realized they had been remembering an old version of you, while an entirely different version had been growing somewhere beyond their view. And now, they can't stop wondering what else happened in your life while they weren't watching. The more they listened, the harder it became for them to pretend they weren't interested. They had only heard your name by accident, but now every detail about your current life seemed to pull them deeper into a conversation they were never supposed to hear. At first, they were simply curious. Then curiosity slowly became disbelief. They had imagined that after everything between you, your life would somehow remain connected to the version of you they remembered. Maybe they thought you would still be carrying the same dreams, the same struggles, the same emotional questions. Maybe they assumed that somewhere inside you, a part of your life was still waiting for the past to make sense. But the person they were hearing about sounded different. You had apparently changed the way you lived, the things you focused on, and even the way you carried yourself. And that was the part they weren't prepared for. Imagine finding an old photograph of someone you once knew by heart, then hearing someone describe that same person years later and realizing you wouldn't recognize their life anymore. The face may be familiar, but the story behind it has completely changed. That is what your soulmate may be experiencing right now. They are beginning to understand that while they were holding on to an old picture of you, life was quietly creating a new one. Perhaps they heard that you had become more private. Perhaps someone mentioned that you were focused on something important, building something for yourself, or simply living with a peace you didn't seem to have before. Whatever the detail was, it challenged the story they had created in their mind, because they may have believed you were still emotionally stuck where they left you. They may have assumed that you were waiting for closure, waiting for an explanation, or secretly hoping they would return. But the conversation suggested something completely different. You weren't standing still, you were moving, and you were doing it without announcing every step. That realization can be surprisingly painful for someone who once felt like they knew your world. They may have thought they understood what made you happy, what hurt you, what you wanted, and what you were afraid of. Now they are discovering that there are entire chapters of your life they never witnessed. And because they heard about those chapters from someone else, they cannot even ask you directly about them. They are left with fragments. A sentence here, a detail there, a casual comment that suddenly feels far more important than the person saying it realizes. Maybe someone mentioned something you accomplished. Maybe they talked about the way you have been carrying yourself lately. Maybe they said that you seem happier, calmer, or more focused than before. To everyone else, those might sound like ordinary observations. To your soulmate, they sound like evidence that the person they remember has continued becoming someone they never got the chance to know. And that can create a strange mixture of emotions. They may feel happy for you, but somewhere beneath that happiness there could be regret. They may feel proud of you, while simultaneously wondering why they weren't there to witness the journey. They may even feel a quiet sting when they realize that the changes they once thought you needed them to help you make happened without them. You kept living while I was still remembering. That is the thought that may be forming inside them now, because they are beginning to see the difference between remembering someone and actually knowing who they have become. They remember the person who used to talk to them, the person who shared certain dreams, the person who reacted to life in familiar ways. But the conversation is introducing them to someone who has evolved beyond those memories. And perhaps the most shocking part is that you didn't need to make a dramatic announcement about your transformation. You didn't need to post something just to make them jealous. You didn't need to make sure your success reached them. You simply lived quietly, privately, naturally. And that makes the discovery even more powerful because your current life wasn't created for their attention. It existed whether they knew about it or not. Your soulmate may now be wondering how many things happened while they were completely unaware. How many difficult days did you overcome without telling them? How many decisions did you make alone? How many dreams did you finally pursue after letting go of what no longer fit your life? They are realizing that they don't have the same access to you anymore, and that realization can make even small pieces of information feel enormous. A simple statement about your life suddenly becomes a window into a world they can only observe from the outside. And the more they hear, the more they begin comparing who you are now with who you were when they knew you closely. That comparison may be where the real shock begins, because they may discover that some of the qualities they once took for granted have become even stronger. Your confidence may be different. Your priorities may have changed. Your energy may feel calmer. Your attention may be focused on things that have nothing to do with the past. And suddenly, they are forced to consider something they never expected. Maybe losing the connection didn't leave you broken. Maybe it gave you the space to become more fully yourself. That doesn't mean the past didn't hurt. It doesn't mean you forgot everything. It means you didn't allow the past to become the permanent definition of your life. And your soulmate may be realizing that now, one overheard sentence at a time. They are hearing about a life they no longer know how to enter, and that uncertainty is making them think about you more than they expected. Because if you have changed this much without them knowing, what else have they misunderstood? What other parts of your life have been unfolding beyond their view? And most importantly, who have you become now that you no longer need the past to tell you who you are? That is the question they are carrying away from that conversation. They may have only heard your name for a few seconds, but those few seconds opened a door they thought had been permanently closed. And behind that door was a version of you they were never prepared to meet. But what they don't know yet is that the biggest shock isn't simply that your life changed. It's what those changes reveal about the person you became after they were no longer part of your everyday world. And now the realization is becoming even more painful for them because they are finally beginning to understand what your silence was actually asking for. You weren't waiting for them to feel lonely. You weren't waiting for them to miss your voice on a quiet night. You weren't waiting for some temporary emotional moment to bring them running back. You were waiting for something much deeper. You wanted them to choose you without being chased. And that difference changes everything. Because if you had kept reaching out, if you had reminded them again and again how much you loved them, if you had begged them to reconsider, you would never have known whether they truly wanted you or simply didn't want to lose the comfort you provided. So you stepped back. You gave them something they may not have understood at the time, a real choice. No pressure, no emotional manipulation, no constant reminders of what the two of you once had. just silence. And inside that silence, they were forced to hear their own feelings. Imagine opening the gate of a garden and then stepping away from it. You don't pull someone inside. You don't chase them down the path. You simply leave the entrance open and allow them to decide whether they want to walk through. That is what your silence may have represented. You weren't locking them out. You were refusing to drag them back in. And now they may be realizing that this was one of the most powerful things you could have done. Because when someone is constantly pursued, they can confuse attention with love. They can mistake persistence for proof that they should return. But when the pursuit disappears, they are left alone with the truth of what they actually feel. Suddenly there is no one convincing them, no one waiting for an answer, no one reminding them of the connection every few days. They have to discover the value of that connection themselves. And perhaps that is exactly what has been happening. They are beginning to remember you without being prompted. They are thinking about conversations you had months ago. They are remembering the way you looked at them when they were vulnerable. They are replaying moments when you chose them, even when they didn't realize they were being chosen. And slowly, the question inside their mind is changing. It is no longer, why isn't this person asking me to come back? It is becoming, why did I expect them to? That question can cut deeply because it forces them to look at the imbalance that may have existed between you. Maybe they became comfortable knowing you would always be the one to reach first. Maybe they assumed your love gave them unlimited chances. Maybe they thought that even if they walked away, you would eventually come looking for them. And when you didn't, something inside them shifted. They discovered that your love had boundaries. You could care deeply and still step back. You could miss them and still refuse to chase. You could want them and still decide that being wanted by them mattered too. I didn't need you to return because I called you back. I needed to know you would return because your heart led you there. That is the truth your soulmate may finally be beginning to understand. And it explains why your silence has become so loud in their mind. They are realizing that you didn't disappear to make them afraid of losing you. You disappeared because you needed to know whether there was anything they were willing to do without being asked. Would they reach out? Would they take responsibility? Would they admit what happened? Would they acknowledge the pain? Would they make an effort without being reminded? Would they choose the connection when there was no guarantee that you would still be standing there? Those questions were never spoken aloud, but perhaps your silence carried every one of them. And now your soulmate may be feeling the weight of those unanswered questions. Because the truth is, choosing someone means very little when the choice is made only after they beg you to make it. You wanted something voluntary, something honest, something that didn't have to be pulled out of them. You wanted to feel that if the world became difficult, they would still turn toward you instead of waiting for you to convince them to stay. And maybe that is why you never asked them to come back. You had already learned that love can become exhausting when one person is always proving it. You had already experienced the emotional cost of asking someone to see what should have been obvious. So eventually you stopped asking, not because you stopped feeling, but because you stopped wanting to convince someone of your value. There is a quiet strength in that decision. It doesn't mean you weren't heartbroken. It doesn't mean you didn't cry. It doesn't mean there weren't nights when you desperately wanted to hear from them. It simply means that you finally understood something your heart had been trying to teach you. The right person shouldn't have to be dragged toward you. They should recognize the path themselves. And now, your soulmate is beginning to understand that your silence gave them the freedom to make that choice. They may be realizing that you didn't want a reunion built on guilt, fear, loneliness, or nostalgia. You wanted a reunion built on awareness. You wanted them to come back because they had finally understood what the connection meant, not because they were afraid of what life would feel like without you. And perhaps that is why their heart feels so heavy now, because they are beginning to realize that you gave them exactly what they asked for without ever saying it: freedom. You allowed them to walk away. You allowed them to experience life without you. You allowed them to discover what your absence felt like. And now that they have had that freedom, they are beginning to wonder whether they made the wrong choice. That thought is powerful because nobody forced it into their mind. It came from their own experience, their own memories, their own heart. And if they eventually reach back toward you, it won't be because you begged them to return. It will be because something inside them finally became strong enough to admit that leaving you didn't make the connection disappear. It only made them realize what it had been worth. And that is the part they are struggling with now. Because they are beginning to see that the person they expected to chase them was actually waiting for something far more meaningful, to be chosen without having to ask. By now, your soulmate is no longer simply surprised that your life changed. They are beginning to understand what those changes actually mean, and this is where the discovery becomes deeply personal. The person they overheard wasn't just describing someone who is doing well. They were describing someone who no longer seems to need the things your soulmate once believed only they could provide. Maybe they heard that you have become more emotionally secure, that you are surrounded by better people, that you have found a purpose that genuinely fulfills you, or that you now seem completely comfortable with your own company. Whatever the detail was, it creates an uncomfortable realization. They may have once believed that your connection filled a space in your life that nobody else could touch. They may have imagined that without them, you would always feel something missing. But now they are hearing evidence that you learned how to fill that space yourself. And that can be difficult to accept, especially when someone once believed they had a permanent emotional place in your world. Imagine returning to a garden you once walked away from, expecting to find the same empty ground you left behind, only to discover that everything has grown without you. Flowers are blooming where you never planted anything. The paths have changed. The garden looks peaceful, and suddenly you realize it didn't stop growing just because you stopped visiting. That may be the emotional shock your soulmate is experiencing. They are discovering that your life continued. You didn't remain frozen in the moment they remember. You kept becoming yourself. And perhaps the most surprising part is that you didn't need to make your transformation visible to them. You weren't trying to send a message. You weren't secretly hoping someone would report your progress. You were simply living. That means whatever they are hearing is genuine. It wasn't created for their attention. It wasn't designed to make them regret leaving. And because of that, it may feel even more powerful. They may begin asking themselves whether they misunderstood you from the beginning. Did they think you needed them when you actually needed encouragement? Did they mistake your attachment for dependence? Did they assume your love meant you would always remain available? These questions can create a deep emotional shift because your soulmate may suddenly recognize that you were never asking them to complete your life. You were asking them to share it with you. There is a huge difference. You could have built a life without them. You simply wanted them to be part of the life you were already capable of creating. I didn't need you to become whole. I wanted you beside me while I became more of myself. That realization can be painful because it changes the meaning of the past. Maybe they once believed they were the source of your happiness. Now they may understand that what you felt for them was never about needing someone to save you. It was about choosing someone to walk beside you. And when they were no longer walking beside you, you eventually learned to continue the journey alone. Your soulmate may also start wondering whether you have become more selective about who gets access to you. Perhaps the person speaking mentioned that you don't open up as easily anymore. Maybe you have become quieter about your plans. Maybe you protect your peace more carefully. Maybe you don't explain your decisions to people who have not earned the right to understand them. These small changes can reveal something much bigger. You learned boundaries. You learned that not everyone deserves access to every part of your world. And your soulmate may realize that they once had a level of access to you that they didn't fully appreciate. They knew your fears. They knew your dreams. They knew the softer parts of you. They may have heard things about your life that made them realize those doors aren't automatically open anymore. That doesn't necessarily mean you became cold. It means you became intentional. And there is something emotionally powerful about realizing that the person who once allowed you into every corner of their heart has learned to protect those corners now. They may begin wondering whether they would even recognize the way you communicate today. Would you tell them everything? Would you trust them with the vulnerable parts of yourself again? Would you even want them to know what your life looks like now? These questions may stay with them long after the conversation ends. Because the real shock isn't that you changed. The real shock is that you changed without needing them to witness it. You found peace without announcing it. You found confidence without asking for approval. You built new routines, new goals, new perspectives, and perhaps even new dreams without needing the past to validate any of them. And now your soulmate is looking at their own memories differently. They may remember moments when you were trying to explain what you needed, only to realize that perhaps they didn't understand how important those needs were. They may remember times when you seemed emotionally overwhelmed, and now wonder whether the person they knew back then would even recognize the calm version of you they are hearing about today. You became the person I never knew you could become because I wasn't there to see it happen. That may be the thought quietly breaking through their mind. And with that thought comes another realization that can be even harder to accept. Someone else may now be experiencing the version of you they once took for granted. Not necessarily romantically, but emotionally. New friends may know your calmer side. New people may respect your boundaries. Others may appreciate your ambition, your loyalty, your patience, and your growth without needing you to prove those qualities. Your soulmate may begin wondering whether they underestimated what they had when you were close. And that is where regret starts becoming impossible to ignore. Because sometimes you don't realize how valuable someone's presence was until you hear someone else describe how valuable that person has become. The conversation they overheard may have lasted only minutes, but it gave them a glimpse into an entire chapter they missed. And now they are left with a question they can't easily silence. If you have created this much peace, strength, and happiness without them, would you even want them back in your life now? That question is what turns their curiosity into something much deeper. Because suddenly, they aren't only interested in what you are doing. They are wondering whether there is still a place for them in the life you built after they were gone. And the final thing they are about to realize may be the one that affects them the most. Your new life isn't simply proof that you moved on. It may be proof that you finally became the version of yourself they never took the time to truly see. And now the part they cannot stop thinking about is no longer the information they overheard. It is what that information means. Your soulmate may have walked away from that conversation knowing a few new details about your life, but somewhere along the way, those details became something much bigger. They became proof that you continued growing when they were no longer there to witness it. They became proof that the person they remembered was only one chapter of your story, not the ending. And perhaps that is why hearing your name affected them so deeply. They didn't simply hear an update about you. They accidentally discovered that your life kept moving forward without asking the past for permission. Imagine opening an old diary and finding a final page you never knew existed. You recognize the handwriting, you remember the emotions, but the words reveal a person who has experienced things you were never there to see. That may be how your soulmate feels now. They remember who you were when they knew you closely, but suddenly they are being introduced to who you became afterward. And that difference is difficult to ignore. They may be wondering whether you ever look back at the connection the way they do. They may wonder if you still remember certain conversations, certain moments, certain promises that once felt important. But beneath those questions is something much deeper. They are wondering whether they still matter in the life you have created now. Because the person they heard about isn't waiting around for the past to return and rescue them from the present. You seem to have found your own direction. You seem to have discovered a version of peace that doesn't depend on someone else staying. And that may be the realization that quietly breaks their heart. They may have assumed that if they ever came back, they would simply find the same version of you standing where they left you. But now they understand that time didn't leave you untouched. You evolved. You learned. You became more careful with your energy. You became more aware of what deserves your attention. And perhaps you learned how to love people without losing yourself in the process. I thought I was leaving someone behind. I didn't realize I was leaving behind a version of their life I would never get to see again. That thought may be sitting heavily inside them now, because they are beginning to understand that some transformations cannot be reversed. You cannot simply return to an old version of yourself because someone from the past finally recognizes your value. The person they once knew may still exist within you, but they have been shaped by everything that happened afterward. Your experiences changed you. Your disappointments taught you. Your quiet victories strengthened you. Your time alone showed you what you were capable of. And now, if your soulmate ever wants to reconnect with you, they would have to meet the person you are today, not the person they remember from yesterday. That realization can create both hope and fear. Hope because they may still believe there is something meaningful between you. Fear because they no longer know whether you would allow them close enough to discover it. They may replay that overheard conversation again and again, trying to remember every detail. They may wonder who else knows about your life. They may wonder how long these changes have been happening. They may wonder why they didn't hear about them sooner. But perhaps the answer is simple. You weren't living for their awareness. You weren't building your life so that one day they would hear about it and regret leaving. You were simply becoming who you needed to become. And that makes everything they learned feel more authentic. There was no performance, no hidden message, no attempt to make them jealous. They simply happened to hear the truth at a moment when they were emotionally capable of understanding it differently. And maybe that is why your name continues to stay in their mind after the conversation ended. Your name became connected to a question they cannot answer yet. Who are they now? Not who were they? Not what did they mean to me? Not what happened between us. Who are they now? That question can become powerful because it shifts their attention away from the past and toward the present. They may begin imagining what it would be like to meet you again. Would your energy feel different? Would you still look at them the same way? Would you be curious about their life? Or would you simply be polite and continue on your way? Would you still carry the same warmth? Would you have the same patience? Would you even want to reopen a chapter they once thought they had permanently closed? They don't know. And that uncertainty may be exactly what keeps them thinking about you. Because when someone has complete certainty about where they stand, the mind eventually becomes quiet. But when there are unanswered questions, the memories keep returning. Your soulmate may now be wondering whether the person they heard about would recognize the person they used to be. And perhaps that is the deepest reversal in this entire story. They once believed you were the one who needed to understand their absence. Now they are the one trying to understand yours. They once thought your life after them would be easy to predict. Now they are realizing that they know very little about the world you created. They once believed they had a permanent emotional place in your story. Now they are wondering whether that place still exists. And this doesn't necessarily mean they are guaranteed to return, or that every connection is destined to reunite. The deeper truth is that sometimes people only understand the significance of your presence after they experience the distance from it. Sometimes hearing your name from someone else's mouth reveals how much information they lost when they stopped being part of your everyday life. And sometimes the greatest shock isn't discovering that someone has changed. It is realizing that they changed beautifully without needing you to witness it. So if your soulmate can't stop thinking about you after hearing that conversation, it may be because your name opened a door they thought they had already closed. Behind that door was not the broken person they expected to find. It was someone who kept living, kept growing, kept healing, and quietly built a life that no longer depended on being understood by the past. And perhaps the thought that stays with them tonight is the simplest and most painful one of all. They thought they knew what your life would look like without them. but they never imagined you would become someone they would have to discover all over again.